Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation. In celebration of Law Day, the Johnson Soyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, and the Saskatchewan branch of the Canadian Bar Association are pleased to partner on today's lecture, Housing, Homelessness, and Human Rights, a discussion about law and policy. My name is Jessie Buydens. I'm a partner with SPM Law, and I'll be today's event moderator. I'm also the treasurer of the Saskatchewan branch of the Canadian Bar Association. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, the physical locations of both CBA Saskatchewan and the Johnson Soyama Graduate School are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. Additionally, today we have a speaker joining from Richmond Hill, which is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations of the Williams Treaty. This is also the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. We are glad to welcome those of you joining today from across Turtle Island and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land you reside on and think about and express gratitude for the place and for the people who have safeguarded it throughout time. If you feel comfortable, you're welcome to share your land acknowledgement through the chat. And as you do, please think about actions we can identify to actively engage in reconciliation to honor the land and its peoples. To help our event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off their video during the presentation portion of the event. Feel free to turn your videos back on for the Q&A. The format for today's event is as follows. Following my introductory remarks, our panelists will each have a 7 to 10 minute overview of the issues. Following this, we'll open it up to audience Q&A for the remaining time. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Zoom chat function to send your question to myself, Jessie Buydens, and I'll read out your question. Feel free to submit questions at any time during today's event. If you have any logistical questions during today's event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen Jaster-Laforge via Zoom's chat or email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. You'll be able to find Karen's contact information in the chat. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later date. This lecture would not exist if not for the partnership between the Johnson Soyama Graduate School of Public Policy and the Saskatchewan branch of the Canadian Bar Association. For those of you who don't know about JSGS, I'm pleased to let you know that JSGS is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. JSGS is a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since its inception in 2007, JSGS has swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. I'm pleased to bring greetings on behalf of the Canadian Bar Association Saskatchewan branch, our board of directors, and over 1,300 provincial members, 39,000 in Canada. The CBA represents lawyers and legal professionals throughout the country. On April 17, 1982, the Constitutional Proclamation was signed by Queen Elizabeth II and then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. This brought the Constitution home and enacted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. CBA introduced Law Day in 1983 to commemorate the event and educate the public about the legal system. We're pleased to once again partner with the Johnson Soyama School of Public Policy for this lecture series. Today's discussion is very important as so many people in our society are facing housing instability, which increases other challenges that they may be facing. I'm thankful that you all chose to attend and participate in today's session. Today's lecture will focus on housing, homelessness, and human rights, a discussion about law and policy. As you'll hear from today's presenters, a lack of housing can escalate existing problems or create further problems for people. For example, a lack of housing increases a person's likelihood of being in contact with the justice system. It also makes it more difficult to attend appointments and to access health services, which are often very needed. It's so much more than a lack of shelter, and I'm very excited to hear and learn from today's speakers. On that, with the logistics out of the way, I'm now pleased to introduce you to today's speakers in the order they'll be presenting. First up, Sarah Buhler. She's an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. Sarah is the daughter of Jake and Louise, the spouse of Charlie, and the mother of Simon, Ben, and Rachel. Sarah joined the University of Saskatchewan College of Law as a faculty member in 2010. Prior to that, she served as the executive director and supervising lawyer at Classic, which is the Community Legal Assistance Services for Saskatoon Inner City, and she worked as a lawyer at a private firm in Saskatoon. Sarah teaches in the areas of legal ethics, housing law, and clinical legal education. Her research focuses on laws and legal processes around eviction and access to justice for renters facing eviction. We've got Shawn Fraser, the Chief Executive Officer of the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan. Originally from Cardiff, Saskatchewan, Shawn Fraser holds a political science degree from the University of Regina. Shawn was a founding member of the Regina Car Share Cooperative. He served as a vice president for the University of Regina Student Union and was a project leader with Katimavik. Shawn has also served his community as the executive director of Carmichael Outreach, as a city councillor for Regina's Ward 3 and senior director of partnerships for the YMCA of Regina. He currently serves as the CEO of the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan, a nonprofit organization with whose mission is to assist individuals who are at risk or involved with the criminal justice process by providing prevention, intervention, support services, and advocacy. He and his wife, Nicole, live in Regina with their 4 young children. Finally, we'll hear from Sharon Crowe, Director of Legal Services at the Community Legal Clinic of York Region. Sharon is the Director of Legal Services at CLCYR. She began her legal career in environmental law before working as a staff lawyer at Hamilton Community Legal Clinic for over 15 years. Sharon has experience in several different areas of law, including housing, human rights, employment, and social assistance. She's been co-counsel on unlawful eviction claims against the police. She regularly advocates for the rights of people experiencing homelessness and is currently involved in litigation challenging the constitutionality of municipal bylaws prohibiting encampments. Sharon is working to establish both ARAOD framework and policies and an Indigenous Justice Initiative at CLCYR. Now that you know who's presenting today, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Sarah to get us started.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes, amazing. Thank you so much for the introductions and for the land acknowledgement. And thanks to my fellow panelists as well. And thanks to all the participants who are here today. So I'm going to start by sharing a few true Saskatchewan eviction stories. Some of these stories are found in published eviction decisions. Others were shared with me as part of qualitative research that I'm undertaking about evictions in Saskatchewan. In one case, the tenant owed her landlord $5. She received an immediate eviction order. In a second case, a tenant was evicted after experiencing domestic violence and abuse. She explained that she had been stabbed and beaten by her former fiancé. She explained that her former fiancé had often refused to allow her to leave the apartment and said, sometimes he wouldn't let me out and he told me he paid the rent, but he didn't. She found herself subject to immediate eviction. In another case, the Ministry of Social Services had made a mistake leading to non-payment of the tenant's rent. That tenant was evicted. And in another example, the tenant was a single mother to 3 children and had just gotten out of a bad relationship. She had been in rental arrears, but had actually paid all of the arrears by the time of the hearing. The landlord insisted that he wanted to proceed with the eviction, and the hearing officer ordered an immediate eviction. Every year, thousands of renters are evicted from their homes in Saskatchewan, and thousands more experience eviction across the country. At our residential tenancies tribunal here in Saskatchewan, landlords almost always get what they come for when they apply to evict a tenant. They receive eviction orders around 90% of the time. And this appears to be somewhat or fairly consistent with approaches across other jurisdictions. So I believe that anyone who cares about housing and the human right to housing should care about eviction. And why is that? So first of all, I'd love to talk a little bit about the impacts of eviction on individuals, families, and communities. So there's actually quite a significant body of research that establishes that eviction from rental housing is associated with myriad harms to tenants and their families. First, we know that eviction leads to homelessness for many renters. And in fact, I've been doing some recent qualitative research and talking to people who've experienced eviction. And most of the people I talked to reported becoming homeless following their evictions. One participant said the following 5 words when I asked what impact eviction had on her life. She said, quote, "Lost my children, became homeless." There's a recent Canadian study where tenants use the language of trauma to describe their experiences of eviction. We know also that eviction is associated with all sorts of negative physical and mental health outcomes. It can lead to child apprehension and the fragmentation of families. It disrupts kids' schooling. It disrupts work and employment opportunities. And having a history of eviction makes it really, really hard for people to subsequently find stable and safe housing in the future. We should also care about eviction because eviction disproportionately affects the most vulnerable members of our society. We know that overwhelmingly, people who experience eviction are already members of groups that face the highest levels of marginalization and discrimination in society. So we know that Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, Black women, trans and gender diverse people, people with disabilities, and youth face the highest rates of eviction. One Canadian researcher described the, quote, "astonishing depth of vulnerability amongst tenants facing eviction." In her research, she found that 1/3 of tenants facing eviction had a disability, 3/4 lived in poverty, half identified as racialized, and 1/5 were single parents. So we always have to ask, what about the landlords? And that's always a question. So the media often portrays landlords as, quote, "mom and pop" type individuals who, might just be trying to make ends meet themselves. And in fact, I would say our legislative and legal processes around eviction often seem to make similar assumptions, positioning landlords and tenants as, more or less equally contracting parties with commensurate interests that just somehow need to be balanced out in some way. One scholar calls this the, quote, "mythologizing of landlord-tenant relationships." And in reality, while we have mom and pop landlords, including my own mom and pop, by the way, the big picture is that there are usually huge power differentials between most landlords and their tenants. I recently did a study where I looked at 6 months of Saskatoon eviction decisions, and I found that the eviction field in Saskatoon is completely dominated by corporate landlords. So 70% of all eviction orders in the period of my study were sought and received by corporations. And in fact, only 3 huge financialized landlords did 1/4 of all of the evicting in the city of Saskatoon. And by the way, one of these financialized landlords, in fact, the landlord that did most of the evicting or had the largest numbers of eviction orders, just announced a multi-million-dollar compensation package for its CEO just this last month. So what does the right to housing have to say about eviction? The Government of Canada finally recognized that housing is a human right in its National Housing Strategy Act in 2019. And we have jurisprudence and commentary from international human rights law about what the right to housing means. I love this quote from the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which said, "The right to housing should be seen as the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity." So what does international human rights law have to say about eviction? So eviction is not prohibited outright in international human rights law, although it's quite clear that eviction into homelessness is seen as a gross violation of human rights. But eviction, international human rights law says that eviction needs to be subject to fair processes. Principles of proportionality should be applied, and eviction should typically only be ordered as a last resort. So other options other than eviction need to be canvassed before eviction would be ordered. So I would say that it's probably likely that evicting a tenant being evicted for owing $5 might be seen as not proportionate and not in compliance with international human rights law. So these international human rights law ideas have not really made their way into our local, provincial and territorial residential tenancies laws and processes. My research these days is focusing on ideas for eviction law reform rooted in the perspective and human rights aspirations of communities that are most affected by eviction. This work is still in progress. I have lots of different projects on the go with various community partners. But so far, my research is suggesting a few things. First, the need for a trauma-informed tribunal and a trauma-informed approach to eviction. A need to truly prioritize and mandate a preventative approach to eviction. A need to increase access to justice for tenants facing eviction. One of the stats that I've found in my research is that 60% of the time tenants don't participate in their eviction hearings. And I'm doing some qualitative work right now where we're talking directly to tenants to learn about what those barriers are that prevent tenants from participating in their hearings. And I think we also need to start measuring success based on the numbers of people who keep their housing rather than on how quickly eviction decisions are processed. Of course, the biggest challenges that we have in front of us are to work towards a world where housing is not seen as a commodity for profit making, and where we stop feeling that it's acceptable to live in a country where so many people are living with so much insecurity with their housing. And this, of course, would require us to address the social and economic inequities that really are at the root of eviction and housing insecurity. The good news, and this is my last comment, is that eviction is not a natural or inevitable occurrence. Eviction is the product of systems and laws that we have chosen as a society to build and construct. For me, that means that there's always a chance that we can change things and we can look at international human rights norms and ideas and make some changes where the human right to housing is a central feature when we talk about evictions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We will pass it over to Shawn now, please.
Hi, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So thanks a lot for that, Sarah. Very inspiring. Yeah, as mentioned, my name is Shawn Fraser. I'm the CEO of the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan. So just want to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the John Howard Society, our involvement, what we do as a whole, and our involvement in this particular issue, and a few other issues, including the federal framework to reduce recidivism. I want to tell you a little bit about. So some of you, I hope, will have heard of the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan. We've been around in Saskatchewan for 65 years. We celebrated our 65th birthday last summer, so pretty long-standing nonprofit in the province. Right now, we have somewhere between 140 and 150 employees, offices in Prince Albert, Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, and Regina. And in a broad sense, what we do, what our mandate is to deal with the causes and consequences of crime and people who have been involved in the criminal justice system. What does that look like on the ground? Well, a few things. We have some stuff that I like to think of as preventative justice, and some that is more directly sort of on the nose, what people traditionally might think of justice support services. So right now we have 8 youth homes across the province, including Lulu's Lodge in Regina, which is a youth home geared to serve LGBTQ2S youth, youth from that community. The reality is in Canada, about a third of all homeless youth are coming from that community. So we saw the need, and around 2018, we decided to get involved. We also have a partnership with the provincial government to provide integrated youth services, which is just getting off the ground. But what that's going to look like is a series of youth mental health drop-in spaces across the province. There'll be some opening up hopefully later this year in Regina, Moose Jaw, Humboldt, and Sturgeon Lake. So looking forward to that. And then as far as the justice programs go, we offer the fine option program in some of the communities we serve. So if you get a ticket and you're not able to work it off, or you don't want to work it off, you can come to us. We'll connect you with the volunteer organization, and you can volunteer off your debt. We also offer help with record suspensions. That's certainly a big issue. A lot of people out there with criminal records that want to get them resolved. So if you come to us, we can help you with that. We have a program called Adults Reintegrating into Community. So working with people who are near the end of their sentence, we help them transition back into society. The program is much too small, but it's very important, and I think it does great work. We also, relevant to this conversation, we offer some adult housing, some form of adult housing in all 4 communities we serve. So I'm going to get a little more into detail to that in a second. I also want to mention that we have now a staff lawyer, a fellow named Pierre Hawkins, who I think is on this call somewhere. Hi, Pierre, if you're out there listening. Pierre is our staff lawyer. And he works predominantly with the prison disciplinary system. So if someone is in a disciplinary process in a prison, you're allowed to have representation, and Pierre can be that representation. An exciting side note, and not to get too sidetracked here, I know this is our time is short, but I just want to mention that Pierre actually has a case that's going to be heard by the Supreme Court. We hope sometime later this year, dealing with the prison disciplinary system. So at the heart of that is right now, if you get in trouble in prison, you don't see a judge, you see a guard. And in the province, that would be whether you're innocent or guilty is based on a balance of probabilities. And we're trying to argue, Pierre's trying to argue on behalf of the John Howard Society that actually in a Canadian context, that should be based on the fact that you're innocent until you're proven guilty, not just a balance of probabilities. So the Supreme Court's going to hear that, and we're really excited. We don't know where it'll land, but exciting to have a little chance to make some real systemic change in the Canadian justice system. So kudos to Pierre for his work on that. Now, quickly, I just want to talk about recidivism. I'm sure that's a word actually, I'm sure it's a word that most of you don't hear as much as I do. It seems to come up all the time in my world. But the gist of it is just recidivism, the idea that when people leave prison, are they coming back? Do we have that kind of revolving door that you leave and come back and you come back and you come back? Well, it turns out that what that looks like in different countries around the world is pretty different. The best numbers I can find out of Australia suggest that about 50% of inmates within 2 years of their release have a new contact with the justice system. And these numbers aren't perfect, but some people suggest that in America, that's up to 75%. Imagine that, 75% of people that leave prison within 2 years, they have a new contact with the justice system. And does anyone want to guess what the number is in Canada? No, this is, I can't actually get to you to respond. I don't have time, I'm sorry, but think about it for a second, give you a second. Okay, and just to let you know, it's a trick question actually, because we don't know in Canada. We don't have good numbers on recidivism. And at the heart of it, as I understand, is that the federal system and the provincial systems can't talk to each other. One uses Excel and one uses Google Docs or something, and they don't. We just don't have the data. So this is a big problem in our system, is we don't even know what our benchmark is. But a little good news to share is that the federal government, since 2021, has been working on the federal framework to reduce recidivism. We hope that the full, they've done some work, there's different phases to it. They've come up with 5 pillars. And that we're hopeful that next spring, in March 2025, we're going to see sort of the final report, sort of what is this going to look like. But I just want to brush on the 5 pillars, and that is education, housing, employment, health, which includes addictions, and positive social networks, which seems like a pretty simple list. I think it's probably a pretty good list. From my personal experience working with inmates a bit over the last 5 years I've been in this position, those are 5 issues that consistently come up. And with not a lot of time left here, I just want to share a couple of anecdotes to kind of support that. One is I mentioned about adult housing. So we have a different program in each of our 4 cities that supports adult housing. We have an excellent program funded through the federal government in Saskatoon that is really just for people exiting the federal or provincial, predominantly the provincial system. We just provide a house. We sublease a house from Saskatoon Housing, has 5 beds and an office. They come to us and they can stay with us, ideally for less than 6 months, but we can be a bit flexible, and we help people get back on their feet. There is so many good stories that come out of that house, and there's such a need for it that if we had 8 of those houses, they would be full tomorrow. Instead, what we have is 1 house and a big long wait list. So the need is there. And again, I've just been able to see firsthand so many pertinent examples of people getting a little bit of support at the right time. And it helps, it works, you know, when people that might otherwise be headed right back into the environment that they were in when they came into prison in the first place, now have a little bit of help to move somewhere else. One final just personal story I want to share is that a couple weeks ago, I had the honor and the privilege to visit the PA Pen. I reached out to the Pen saying I wanted to talk to their inmate committee about a garden project that they've been working on and John Howard wants to help with. So I reached out to the warden, and the warden said, yeah, no problem, we'll hook you up with the inmate committee. And then a couple days before I was supposed to be up there, I got an email saying, oh, sorry, we kind of got our wires crossed. Someone got the wires crossed, and instead of inviting the inmate committee, we just put out to everybody. So we said, if they want to come meet John Howard, you can come to the gym tomorrow and you'll meet John Howard Society. So that seemed cool to me. This was on the minimum security side. So I got to go and spend an hour or two in a gymnasium with 39 inmates from minimum federal, PA Pen, the federal side, but the minimum security. And it was really inspiring. You know, I got to share a little bit about what John Howard is doing. And at the end, I asked, if you were in my shoes, if you're in our shoes, what would be the next program we should offer? And without a doubt, all the answers that came back were directly related to those 5 things. But particularly employment, actually, people said employment is a big barrier for them, that they're not able to gain the skills they'd like to while they're sitting there doing nothing in prison. They come out broke and they come out with this big gap on their resume that makes it really, really hard to do. So I'm left heartened, I guess, that this federal framework to reduce recidivism has a real opportunity to make real change for a few reasons. One, there's just so many low-hanging fruit. There's so little resources there for people coming out of prison. Presumably, Canadians' number for recidivism is so high that there's just lots of work we can do to bring it down. And yeah, I also think that it's this weird political issue that's a bit bipartisan. You know, there's so many issues that are, you're on this side of the issue, you're on that side of the issue. Even within justice, you know, I think there's a lot of hearts and minds that will never be changed about the system needs to be more punitive. And there's a lot of hearts and minds that will never be changed, but it should be all restorative. And the fact is, when it comes to recidivism, I think we can all agree that when you leave prison, like, don't come back. Let's make it so that if you leave prison once, you don't have to come back in again. And I've been waiting to hear like an argument against that, and I can't think of it. So I'm optimistic that we're going to see some progress, hopefully at the federal level, when it comes to recidivism in the coming years. And housing, we'll get into this now about what housing means in that, but housing has to be a big part of that. So with that, I'm going to stop, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Shawn. And we will turn it over to Sharon for the final presentation before Q&A.
Thank you. Before I start, I'll just apologize. I'm a little bit under the weather, so just bear with me. I'm going to pick up where Sarah left off in terms of talking about what can happen to some people once they become homeless, where they have to exist in a housing market that is completely unaffordable, and emergency shelters are often full. And that is that they can sometimes end up staying in homeless encampments. So this is by no means an exhaustive definition, but encampments can take many forms, including several people who are experiencing homelessness putting up tents and other temporary structures in one location and staying together. But it can also be someone living on their own in a tent. Often encampments are located in parks, parking lots, green spaces, and other public lands. Staying in an encampment is a matter of survival, and not one that's done out of leisure or choice. So we try to avoid the using the term camping when we're talking about encampments. I am one of the lawyers representing 19 people who have experienced repeated encampment evictions in Hamilton, Ontario, in an action against the city where we argue that the bylaws that the city relies on to evict people from encampments are unconstitutional. So usually what happens is that, you know, the municipalities have parks bylaws or a streets bylaw that prohibit people from putting up tents or other temporary structures in various public spaces. And then municipalities use those bylaws as a way to ticket or kick people out of those spaces. I'm going to give an overview of some of the developing legal landscape around encampment evictions. So what is encampment litigation all about? Factually, it asserts that number one, encampments are an essential last resort where there is a shortage of indoor shelter options, such as permanent housing and emergency shelter spaces. Put simply, many people experiencing homelessness have no other choice because they can't afford rental housing and shelters are full. And number two, when you evict people from encampments when they have nowhere else to go, it causes serious harms. So, I'm sorry. Nobody who is involved in encampment litigation tries to idealize encampments or suggest that they're any kind of appropriate or suitable housing response or option, but they are an unfortunate reality because of the affordable housing crisis that we continue to find ourselves in. Encampment litigation really started about 20 years ago in BC and largely centered around arguments that encampment evictions violate Sections 7 and 15 of the Charter. Section 7 being the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and Section 15 being equality rights. And the basis for Section 7 arguments are that encampment evictions cause real, serious, and tangible harms. Everything from the loss of belongings, exposure to elements, disconnection from community, social, and medical supports, increased risks of violence, and injuries such as frostbite. In Hamilton, our applicants have been raped, assaulted, robbed, and shot while sleeping unsheltered. They've lost toes and legs from amputations from frostbite and infections, all as a result of being evicted from their encampments. And the basis for Section 15 arguments is that racialized and Indigenous peoples, individuals with mental health and physical disabilities, are overrepresented in the homeless population. Women's shelters are often at or over capacity, and as such, there is a disproportionate impact of encampment evictions on these groups, oftentimes on intersecting grounds like gender, race, and disability. In BC, the courts gradually recognized a right to overnight shelter where there were not enough shelter beds to accommodate the homeless population. Litigation made its way to Ontario in 2020, when the start of the pandemic saw a dramatic increase in both the number and visibility of encampments in many municipalities. Toronto and Hamilton, for example, sought injunctions to stop the cities from dismantling encampments. Toronto lost its injunction while Hamilton won and later settled the case. And that resulted in a new encampment protocol. However, Hamilton abruptly revoked the protocol and returned to what it called pre-pandemic enforcement. And that led to the second round of encampment litigation, which is still before the courts, with a hearing date scheduled for October. A watershed moment for encampment litigation nationally really came in the early 2022, I believe, in a case in Waterloo, Ontario, where the city applied for an order asking for permission to clear a large encampment from a vacant parking lot. And the court denied the application. And there were three particularly significant outcomes from this decision. Number one, the court found that there were not enough shelter spaces to accommodate the unhoused population. Second, and even more significantly, the court acknowledged that the shelter system is often unable to accommodate the needs of people who need to access them. And this is something that for me has been such a learning curve in doing this work, something I certainly didn't understand before. The court in Waterloo accepted both the applicant and expert evidence about the various very legitimate reasons why someone may be unable to or unwilling to access a shelter bed, even if one was theoretically available. So for example, a lot of shelters don't allow for substance use. They don't allow you to be under the influence or to sometimes even have any harm reduction materials on your person. Couples often have to separate in order to access shelter beds. People usually can't bring their pets into shelter. And oftentimes what we see is, people with complex mental health and addiction disabilities that leads to, disruptive or, quote unquote, problematic behavior. And that leads to them being service restricted or banned from shelters. In fact, we have at least one applicant in our Hamilton case who at various times has been banned from all Hamilton shelters. So this was the first time that the court really delved into the suitability of shelter spaces and not just the number of shelter beds that are available. And it's really an essential element to understanding some of the reasons why encampments exist. Third significant outcome was that the court extended the right to put up a tent during daytime hours. And so up until this point, all that had been recognized was the right to put up a tent overnight, and the expectation that people were going to take down their tent every morning and, just wander around with their belongings and then put the tent back up around sunset. Our argument is that the ability to leave a tent in place during daytime hours is essential to prevent the harms from encampment evictions. When people have to spend all of their energy packing up belongings and moving from location to location, they're exposed to the elements. It's exhausting. They often lose belongings or they're damaged. And they're unable to spend time attending appointments or connecting with supports. They get trapped in this cycle of day-to-day just survival mode. The next encampment case in Ontario was in Kingston, where the court dismissed the city's application to clear a large encampment. Notably, the city conceded at the last minute that its bylaws were in fact unconstitutional, to the extent that they prevented overnight tenting, and there were not enough shelter spaces. And the court stated, quote, to borrow the language from Bedford, a law that prevents the homeless from avoiding a serious risk of injury or death by erecting shelter overnight when there is nowhere else to go is a law that has lost sight of its purpose. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the court kind of clawed back some of the progress that was made in Waterloo and found that the right to put up a tent or temporary structure was restricted to 1 hour before sunset and ending at 1 hour after sunrise. And while we welcome the declaration that a prohibition of overnight tenting was unconstitutional, the need to pack up and move every day is highly problematic. The silver lining is that the court made it clear that that finding with respect to the right to daytime shelter was fact specific, which leaves the door open to other cases to show that there's a lack of daytime indoor shelter options available for people if they need to leave the encampment every day. Alberta and Quebec have also gone through encampment litigation with varying results. A BC court in Bamberger set aside the local parks authority eviction order and urged the park authority to draft a policy which included daytime sheltering. In Edmonton, a court found that a group of homeless advocates did not have the standing to argue for an injunction, and it even awarded costs against the coalition in dismissing the application. Encampment litigation is, it's costly. If we were look at the very short litigation that happened in Waterloo, the legal fees for the city were well over $100,000 over the course of just a few months. It's time consuming, and it's an ever evolving area of law with sometimes little predictability on both sides. But at this point, given the most recent cases, it's arguably settled law that encampment evictions cause harm, and those harms can often amount to a violation of charter rights. There's also growing external authorities, such as the most recent report of the Federal Housing Advocate that reinforces both the futility and the harms of encampment evictions. So we'd like to see municipalities, therefore, modernizing their encampment policies, recognizing that the bylaws that they're using to enforce encampment evictions were not drafted in contemplation of the affordable housing crisis that continues to ravage the country, to work with other levels of the government to coming up with, housing solutions, because housing ultimately is the solution for encampments. And in so doing, coming up with modernized policies, consulting with the in-house community and stakeholders should really be at the root of policy making. And they should be using a human rights framework that recognizes both the lack of alternatives to many people using encampments and the harms of displacement where there's a lack of suitable indoor alternatives. So just in closing, it's so essential to try to incorporate the voices of those with lived experience into these discussions. And I couldn't quite do that today, but the closest I have is a redacted excerpt from a psychiatric report where a psychiatrist has volunteered to meet with our applicants to assess the psychological impacts of encampment evictions. And so she met with one of our applicants, and here's what she wrote. Quote, each time she loses her possessions and is forced to move, she reports increased feelings of hopelessness with worsening depression and trauma symptoms, which in turn cause her to use increasing amounts of substances. While she used to find safety and comfort living in a tent amongst others in community, she has given up attempting to do so and now sleeps outside without shelter. Because she is forced to sleep outside, she gets very little sleep and uses large amounts of stimulants to stay awake and protect herself. It is my opinion that encampment evictions and the repeated threat thereof have been major contributors to the ongoing instability of her mental health and worsening of her substance use disorders. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you to our speakers for their excellent presentations. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Just a reminder to our audience that if you have any questions, please send them to me, Jessie Buydens, through the Zoom chat. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, Karen's also put a direction in the chat of how to get a question to me. But while we're waiting for questions to come in from the audience, I have a couple questions for our speakers. Sarah, you mentioned that it's been determined that housing is a human right, but what does that mean practically? So twofold, how would a tenant challenge an eviction based on human rights? And what legal services are available to people facing evictions outside of private lawyers who they likely can't afford?
Okay, thanks for that question. So in Canada right now, I think it's fair to say that we are just starting, I think, to really grapple with what the right to housing means in all areas relating to housing law and processes. I know that Sharon is working deeply in that area. When it comes to, and I think I mentioned this, so I mean, there's international, there's commentary and jurisprudence from international human rights law that that exists, but of course we know that you know, even though Canada has, you know, signed and ratified different international human rights law, you know, treaties and commitments, that doesn't mean that those automatically get transferred into all of our laws. That has to be done at the local level. So it would, so right now, I mean, I think that it is possible to, you know, probably show up in court or in a tribunal and draw on international human rights law principles, but those aren't really part of our law, so to speak. So I think that they can inform the interpretation of our law. I think the task ahead is to actually do some work on law reform and to actually try to integrate some of these principles into our legislation and into our legal practices. I think that's work that still needs to be done in various areas in our country. So in terms of assistance and access to justice for tenants who are facing eviction, in most provinces and territories in Canada, there's, you know, there's legal aid assistance in some provinces and territories, but most have no formal legal aid programs that are there to assist tenants. So most tenants don't have legal assistance. There's a really significant and growing body of research, mostly in the United States, that shows that when tenants have access to legal assistance, their outcomes are usually better, and that eviction, that is one process or strategy for preventing eviction and ensuring that you know, tenants get a fair process. But right now, that is something that is still yet to be done. So I should mention that the recent federal budget that was just announced last week or a couple weeks ago includes, there's a lot of money in there relating to housing. And one of the pieces in there that I'm really interested in learning more about is there's funding, I think it's about $15 million that's supposed to be targeted towards a tenant legal assistance fund, which, so it may be the case that there might be some more support for tenant legal assistance coming, at least from the federal government. Probably $15 million really go very far when you think of this, the magnitude of the problem across the country. And I should mention that community-based legal clinics are doing a lot of advocacy for tenants. So here in Saskatchewan, we have Classic that's representing tenants. We have Pro Bono Law Saskatchewan, even though our legal aid, formal legal aid, Saskatchewan doesn't have assistance for tenants. I hope that answers those questions. Thank
It
you.
does. Thank you, Sarah. Loretta is going to unmute and ask a question. Loretta, if you can unmute and ask that.
Hi, this is for all three panelists, but I had it directed toward individuals. There's two questions. My understanding and experience is that so much of what exists is as law or policy is outdated, colonial charity-based view. In other words, those with means or resources are feeling sorry for those without, and it's constantly in a loop of helping those without rather than it being based on a policy based on needs or universal needs. At present, trauma-informed law, as I understand it, is an optional education component. What policy could reform legal education at the secondary, post-secondary, and current law education in Saskatchewan so that the judges, the lawyers involved in anything to do with estates, homelessness, houselessness, income, can be more accurately informed and bridge the gap between the class?
Thank you for that, Loretta. I don't know which of our panelists wants to answer first, but I'll let the three of you decide who's speaking to that.
I'll have a second question that's related.
The first thing that came to mind, Loretta, was you're probably familiar with the Trauma Informed Lawyer podcast out of Vancouver. She's a Métis Cree lawyer who advocates and addresses exactly that, how that piece is missing from curricular in law schools, and is advocating for increasing awareness and inclusion that into curriculums, and also like continuing professional development. I agree that is a really important piece. From my perspective, in terms of like the encampment work that I've been doing, the unwillingness of government officials to listen to and consult with people with lived experience and their stakeholders is like a fundamental gap in how we respond. Actually, so Hamilton now has a new encampment protocol, which does allow for encampments in various locations in the city. It's far from perfect, but it's definitely better than where we were a few years ago. But when the city announced that it was going to be preparing and seeking consultation on an encamp protocol, several community groups and stakeholders, and more importantly, people with lived experience, put together what they called the People's Protocol and put that to council and asked them to consider that to inform, the new protocol that the city would develop, and they refused to even review it as part of this process. So it's pretty offensive, just like from the starting point, and it feeds into a lot of the paternalism and then the problematic attitudes that we just kind of see reverberating with encampment responses. I'll leave it there.
I could jump in. I just really want to reiterate, those questions are so important, and the importance of involving people with lived experience in any sort of policy or law reform is absolutely crucial. And that's what I'm trying to do in some of the research that I'm doing. And I've been finding, for example, that so when I talk to tenants, one of the things I'm doing is talking to tenants who got evicted, but they didn't participate in their eviction hearing, and trying to find out, like, well, why is that? Why didn't you attend, and what barriers there might have been? And one of the things that people are saying, it speaks exactly to your question, Loretta. There is like this deep knowledge that people have that they won't be, their perspectives or their lived experience or their their situation won't be understood or taken seriously by decision makers. So I think that really speaks to the importance of doing more to educate and ensure that people in positions of decision-making power and policy-making power have some more understanding. One thing I was going to mention is the Federation of Law Societies of Canada has just recently released proposed amendments to the Model Code of Professional Conduct for lawyers that includes the response to the TRC call to action that's aimed at the legal profession. And I think there's some really good stuff in those proposed amendments for the legal profession that include references to trauma-informed practice and training. So it may be that change will be coming in terms of legal education and requirements.
All right, thank you, Sharon and Sarah. I know you said you had a second question, Loretta, but there are a couple people lined up in the chat. So I'm going to ask questions from other people, and then if we have time, come back to you for your second question. One of the questions in the chat: what can be done in Saskatchewan to develop renters associations that work or negotiate with corporate landlords to hold them to account? Sarah, this might be something for you. You had mentioned the evictions being largely corporate landlords. Is there something that you can speak to, or either of the other panelists as well?
I don't know. I know that there's lots of great examples from other jurisdictions about successful tenant organizing that has led to positive changes. I'm not really an expert in all of the details of how that could happen, but I know that there are and have been groups in Saskatchewan doing this kind of work. I think it's always tough, but I know that there are examples from other jurisdictions. There's a recent book, and I forget the name, that has some history. I'll look it up and put it in the chat. That has chronicled some of the history of tenant organizing in Canada. So I will look for that, but I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Shawn or Sharon, do either of you have comments on organizing tenant associations?
Yeah, I could comment briefly on that. I have a little bit of experience in dealing with the Office of Residential Tenancies just through some of my work in the nonprofit sector, and I would say it's my overwhelming sense that when it comes to dealing with the tenancy office, I mean, there's policy that needs to get changed, but a big thing that needs to happen is that people don't necessarily understand their rights in the first place that we have right now. Like the barrier to access is not necessarily always about policy. It's about tenants not necessarily making it to the office in the first place because they're not informed. So I think that's where it starts, is that how do we make sure that ourselves and those around us who are tenants know their rights, and that might blossom into tenant associations, that sort of thing. But even just as an individual renter, understanding those rights and responsibilities and freedoms you have in place already.
Thank you, Shawn. And for participants, I see that Sharon has put a link to a document about encampments in the chat if you want to look at that. That last question ties into another question in the chat. Can't the success of the Housing First program in Medicine Hat be duplicated anywhere? Aren't decision makers swayed by the costs of homelessness being more expensive than the status quo of homelessness? Anybody want to comment on that? I'm not familiar with the housing program in Medicine Hat, so perhaps our speakers are.
Yep, maybe that's another one I can touch base on. Thanks for bringing it up. We talked about Housing First in Medicine Hat. Actually, Housing First, Medicine Hat was the first Canadian city to kind of dive in a full way and claim to have ended homelessness, which, just so people know what that means, is that there was a guarantee in place that when you presented as homeless, as a homeless shelter or someone within that sort of network, that there was sort of a public guarantee that within a set amount of time, I think it was maybe 2 weeks in Medicine Hat, that we would find you an address. And I'll say that that headline now is a bit like, that was kind of version 1 of Housing First in Canada. Now we're sort of probably into version 3 or 4, even, you know. There are Housing First efforts underway in all Canadian, probably close to all or all Canadian, major Canadian cities, including Regina, Saskatoon. And it does work. It doesn't, it's not free, but not doing anything isn't free either. To house someone in a federal institution in Canada costs over $170,000 a year. To house someone in a Housing First program in Canada costs between, there's newer numbers than this, but I would say like 25 to 40,000 would be like a reasonable amount to suggest for kind of those wraparound supports. Again, there's probably newer numbers than that, but from a few years ago, that was kind of the range. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, switching gears a little bit. Is this not an issue of distribution of resources? When a person or group of people do not have access to the resources required to assure housing and other human rights, does society, in brackets, the government, not have a responsibility to level the inequality or inequity? A landlord, good, better, otherwise cannot be expected to address the root cause. And I think, Sarah, you touched on this a little bit with the federal budget and increased funding, but does anybody want to speak to governmental responsibilities, especially when we know that it's been deemed a human right?
I can speak to the fact that the courts have not recognized a positive right to housing, right? That's rooted in the charter, unfortunately. So they'll go so far as to make an order against conduct that amounts to a charter breach, but it doesn't then take the extra step of like acknowledging a positive right to housing, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
I might just chime in on that. Who asked the question? I'm sorry, Jessie. And that's okay if you don't have it right in front of you, but whoever asked the question.
Malcolm asked the
thank
question.
you. Malcolm, you just hit it right on the head. All of this is about poverty and inequality. That's kind of like what it all comes back to. The challenge, I think, in Canadian society is that housing actually plays, it wears 2 hats. You know, that's always difficult, right? When you have to have one thing that has kind of two motivations. And in Canada, I think a home has 2 important roles. One is hopefully first, it's a home, right? It's where people live. It's how people stay dry and warm. It's where people raise their families, make memories. It's surely one of the most important parts of being alive, being a human, is having like whatever a home looks like for you. That's like, it's an important part of that story, isn't it? But also in Canada, it turns out that a home is actually like, it is a commodity. It's part of our economy. Most of us, I imagine, are working some job right now. I don't want to presume, but most of us on this call have some important job, I'm sure. The reality is that while all the jobs are important, not all jobs bring new money into the local economy. You know, if you're a farmer, if you're a miner, if you're involved in like R&D, you know, trademarkable R&D, or you're exporting arts and culture, if you're exporting something, you can bring new money to the economy. But for most of us, we work very important jobs that have very important impact on the quality of life and those outcomes that whatever your sector is, it's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but there's only a few ways that new money comes into an economy. And in Canada, for most of us, one of our big contributions to new money is a mortgage. You know, you buy a house and you pay a bunch of money to a local builder or a local real estate agent or someone else, and that money comes from the bank, and it wasn't in the local economy before, and now it is. And for most of us, again, our whole lives will do important work to support the economy, but we're not bringing in new money except for that mortgage. So that is tricky because it's important, right? How much money is in an economy? It matters, you know, it does matter, for better or for worse. It matters. It affects how much money there's for individuals, how much money there's to build schools and build roads and hospitals and all those good things. And we have this thing in Canada where like individuals getting a mortgage to buy a house is actually kind of a cornerstone of how we keep the economy afloat. And the challenge is that if we lean too heavily on that, like, I'm not trying to say it's necessarily a good or bad thing, but I will say if we lean too heavily on that, there's consequences. And the consequences can be that we worry so much about like house values, right? And so much of our policy decision is about keeping house values up or bringing them, like keeping them in check with other communities or whatever, that we can lose sight of that first piece of a home is that it's a first piece of a house, that it's a home, right? And we end up with things like poverty. I'm taking too much time here, but I just want to say, Sarah, you mentioned something in your introduction saying that, sorry, I made a note here. You said that something was a social construct. Evictions, right? Evictions aren't like a natural thing. They're like a social construct. I'd like to make clear too, like homelessness is a social construct. Homelessness isn't a natural state, right? The issues that can lead to it, mental health and addictions and those things, those are human issues. You know, we can't get rid of those, but the fact that homelessness exists is that's Canada's problem. That's like, or Saskatchewan's problem. That's like our society has decided to let that exist. And I even forget what the initial question is. So sorry, I'm taking up too much airtime here. But just to close off this thought, I'll just say that if we lose sight of homes being places for people to live, we end up with things like the poverty we see in our streets right now and homelessness. Some of us are old enough to remember a time before we had encampments. That's not that long ago, actually. You know, 15 years ago, I was working at Carmen Glenreach. We had poverty, but we didn't have encampments. It was only 15 years ago. You know, like things have changed quickly, and it's not to say that things can't unchange. I could go on for hours, so I'll stop. Back to you, Jessie.
It actually looks like Sarah has a
Oh,
comment.
I just wanted to jump in and just add to that, just for context, Canada relies on the private housing market to a much greater extent than many of our peer countries, like in the G20. So I think this idea of like housing as a commodity, I think really it kind of seems like the way things are, but that isn't necessarily the way things are, you know, in other parts of the world, where governments are much more, and governments in Canada used to be much more involved in providing housing, social housing, you know, subsidized housing, public, you know, contributions to housing. So our market-based system isn't inevitable. It's kind of the way we've set things up in Canada. It's different elsewhere.
So I think our next question actually is a really good follow-up on what Shawn and Sarah were just saying. But the question is, could we change laws and policies to limit massive swings in housing costs to stabilize the market and make housing more accessible? If not, how do we address the seemingly never-ending disproportionate increase in housing prices? So that ties in, and maybe you've got some examples of how it's done elsewhere, Sarah.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, absolutely. The question was, could we change laws and policies to limit massive swings in housing costs to stabilize the market and make housing more accessible? If not, how do we address the seemingly never-ending disproportionate increase in housing prices?
Oh boy, I feel like that there's like many layers there. And I feel like I don't even know how I could answer that here. I think that law, I guess the main thing that I've kind of come to think is that law is involved in, you know, I've had people say to me like, oh, this isn't really like eviction, these other issues, housing, homelessness. They're actually like issues to do with like macroeconomics, like in economics, like it's not really law. But I believe, you know, law is, it's part of, you know, how we set up our society. Like we create laws that touch on housing and homelessness in so many different areas. So if you think of like the big picture laws to do with, you know, labor laws, you know, that, you know, are put in place to make sure that people, you know, have living wages, like those kinds of things, those touch on housing and homelessness. I do think that there are, you know, there are some jurisdictions where there are residential, there's laws about, you know, for example, rent control, and then there's mixed research about, you know, sort of like what laws like that actually do to house prices and stuff like that. But I do know that, you know, there definitely are laws and law reforms that can be made that target issues to do with affordability. I know there's a lot of research right now on the massive growth we're seeing right now about the financialization of housing, and I spoke about that a little bit in my comments, and that has to do with the legal structures that allow these real estate investment trusts to exist. I believe they have like fairly favorable tax treatment, that kind of thing, and they've become, you know, incredibly profitable. And you know, their clear goal is to generate profits for their investors. So, you know, I feel like there's a lot of like different angles to get at that question, and I am not an expert in that area, but there's definitely research to be done there.
I've got a comment unless Sharon, you have anything to add?
I can go after you.
Okay, so just quickly, great question, big question. If anyone tries to tell you that there's a simple answer, they're trying to sell you something. There's no one simple answer, but the short answer I would say is yes, there's things to do. I would say that our governments, all levels of government are constantly tweaking things. I mean, the obvious ones would be things like interest rates. You know, that's what that's about. in part, it's general inflation, but it's housing inflation as part of that. Immigration is part of that, but again, it's not just in a vacuum of like housing and immigration, because immigration, there's lots of it relates to all sectors of society, you know, so it's complicated, but those decisions have an impact on these things. Also, there's like internal like migration, where jobs are, people moving, that sort of thing. Two low-hanging fruits though that I think could change. One is Sask housing could get their act together and start competing with private landlords in a better way. It doesn't make sense to me that we've had so many empty units for so long. There's lots of excuses. We hear lots and lots of excuses all the time. But ultimately, some of them are just excuses, you know, like we could just invest in a public housing provider that was competing with private sector housing providers and making them do better. Sometimes I think we sort of like the spirit isn't there really to like compete and make, you know, drive rents down and make people fix up those renos in their private sector ones. There's something unsaid that happens there that disserves people who are most vulnerable in our society. And another one is about zoning. You know, I think it's tricky for cities to get really hands-on with zoning because again, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, there's like lots of moving sectors and municipalities competing with neighboring municipalities and that sort of thing. But ultimately, to oversimplify a very complicated process, there's more money for people to build big, expensive houses. There's sometimes a higher margin than there is building affordable units. And municipalities do actually have the tools in place. Political will is a different story, but they do have some tools in place to say, hey, if you're going to build one, you got to build the other. And we have some great examples of that across the province. And lots of times I think we miss out on some opportunities to do that. Again, I'm not trying to make it sound easy, but there's certainly tools there when it comes to municipalities' ability to allow the private sector to make money, but make money building what's needed, not just where the most profit is. And yeah, Sask housing, come on, let's, why do we have empty units? So that's all for me, thanks.
I was just going to add, I mean, from the Ontario perspective, we haven't had rent control over vacant units in well over a decade, and that has continued despite the provincial government in power. It continued with the Liberals, and now we have a Conservative government. And I'm always astonished to see, you know, how much resistance there is and how much protectionism there is of like a group of landlords who benefit from this rule compared to how harmful it is, and the direct correlation between the absence of rent control and vacant units and the dramatic increases in rent. And it's something that could be done with the stroke of a pen. You know, there's no infrastructure that needs to happen. There's no building, no permits, stroke of a pen, and we could have a dramatic impact on housing affordability. But as we were saying, it's, you know, it's often down to political will.
Thank you all for that informative answer. There was a question in the chat, who is the speaker that just says iPhone? That's Shawn Fraser with the John Howard Society, just for that.
Thanks, sorry.
Okay. Shifting gears a little, this is more of an academia related question. Having evidence-informed policies seems critical to policy reforms around housing and homelessness. However, research involving people with experiences of homelessness faces challenges gaining ethical approvals to engage this population. Do you think research ethics boards have a role to play in facilitating the engagement of people with lived experiences in research on homelessness? I don't know who wants to answer that.
Like, I can jump in. I'm at a university. I've worked a lot with research ethics boards. Absolutely. I think any research must be ethical, and research ethics boards at universities can help facilitate ethical research. And there's you know, a lot of sensitivity about research that works directly with people with lived experience. But I can say that there's, beyond university research ethics boards, there's a lot of there's also like a huge body of knowledge and expertise that has been developed directly by communities and people with lived experience about ethical research and ethical community-based research. And so I think, again, you know, working directly with communities to, you know, of course, like for me, I always have to work with a university-based research ethics board before doing any sort of community engaged research. But you know, anyone working, any policymaker or advocate working on directly with people with lived experience equally must ensure that their methods and approaches are ethical. And there's lots of resources out there about that. So.
Thank you, Sarah. The next one is a double question about the Office of Residential Tenancies. And it says there's a recent requirement of rental agencies requiring double the income of the rental property price. I feel this is a human rights violation that the Office of Rentalsmen should be upholding in the public value. Should the ORT be responsible for maintaining security of tenure by addressing housing market requirements? And the second half of the question, can the Office of Residential Tenancies be sued for failing its dual function of maintaining a healthy housing market economy and maintaining strong social structures through representation? 90% of the rulings of the ORT are in favor of the lawyer. That's, I believe, something you had said, Sarah. So I don't know who wants to address one or both of those questions.
Yes, I can, like, maybe it's directed at me. The first question, I mean, I think we do have, I'm not, maybe I didn't understand the question exactly. There are rules about, you know, how much of a security deposit a landlord can require. Like there are, we have rules, we have frameworks around that. Unfortunately, I know it's the case that there are some landlords out there that aren't necessarily following the law that exists. So there's multiple challenges, including, you know, those power relationships that I talked about, that sometimes tenants, and Shawn as well, sometimes tenants often don't know what their rights might be. And then first, and then second, like how to go about enforcing those, especially when there's such unequal bargaining power and you're kind of desperate to get a place, and you're really hoping, you know, not to get evicted. And so, you know, there's lots of research about how that can lead to all sorts of problems. The second question about suing, I don't think that's the way things, that's not really, I would say, the right way to go about, you know, if there's decisions that are made that aren't fair, or that, you know, aren't in line with the law, or that, you know, that someone wants to challenge, there's an appeal process. Of course, there's sometimes barriers to figuring out how to, you know, go to the Court of King's Bench and appeal something. But I know that, you know, Classic, for example, assists lots of tenants with appeals to their decisions, and is, you know, sometimes successful in those appeals, for sure. So that's sort of how the process would normally work. I'm not sure if Sharon or Shawn would have something else to say there.
Yeah, I was going to ask if Sharon, you might have a perspective either from Ontario or based on your litigation history and involvement in fact, suing people for these types of issues.
So the first part of the question was about having specific requirements, rental requirements on specific groups.
and whether the Office of the Residential Tenancy should be responsible for maintaining security of tenure by addressing those market requirements. Yeah, that was the first.
Okay, so we don't have the equivalent body in Ontario, but under the Ontario Human Rights Code, yes, if it's like if those requirements are being imposed on a protected group, and not imposed, uniformly on all tenants, then there would be the potential for a human rights claim against the landlord who is making the requirements. So what we see sometimes is like a landlord requiring a newcomer to pay a year's rent up front, for example, and they don't make that requirement for all tenants. That would be considered discriminatory.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears again to justice, is there a way to prevent the release of incarcerated people into homelessness, such as requiring transitional housing to be available?
Great question. I'll say there's a long way to go because there are a lot of people that are released without a fixed address, without a ride now too. With Sans STC, you see lots of people walking from Regina Correctional to town. That's because you get let go and kind of good luck. We'll see you in a month. Sometimes feels like the attitude again, not to hate the players, but to hate the game. I think the question was about is there a way to say people can't be released into homelessness? I think that's wouldn't that be a great start? Again, a long ways to go because we also wouldn't want to hold up a lot of people's release. But if the resources were there, I think that would be a reasonable expectation that people have somewhere to go when they leave. But that is not the case now.
I think there's so much fear in the legal system of creating this positive right to housing. So whether it's a discharge from jail or even like a discharge from hospital, like the amount of people who are discharged from psychiatric wards into homelessness is shocking. Like, how can you possibly expect someone to be able to function, in that type of environment? And when I was listening to the encampment case in Kingston a few months ago, I was really struck by how much the judge was like so reluctant to do anything that might even come close to the realm of creating a positive right to housing, even in the context of encampments, which, arguably it'd be very difficult to say that, living in a tent is an appropriate form of housing. But yeah, when the judge was talking about, what does it mean to have accessible shelter options? And how could a municipality ever prove that? And if they can't prove that, am I then creating inadvertently stumbling into a positive right to housing? I think it's just like a very real and unfortunate fear that the justice system continues to hold on to.
You. We're getting close to the end of our time. So last question, and I'll put it to all three of you. If you could magic wand here, what would be an ideal scenario or solution to address the issues that have been raised today? If that's not too daunting of a question.
Well, I'll speak in a more limited sense with respect to encampment evictions. And fundamentally, the answer and the solution has to be housing, and often supportive housing, because the longer someone is homeless, the more, chronic mental health and addiction issues they're likely to develop. So just putting them into a housing unit without appropriate supports might not, could still result in kind of a cycle of displacement and eviction. So yeah, I mean, yes, the creation of housing, and failing that, a pause in encampment evictions, right? Allow people to shelter in place, connect them with the supports. The Office of the Federal Office of the Federal Housing Advocate just did a great report recently, giving guidelines to all levels of government in terms of like how you should be responding in this interim period, where the reality is that we don't have suitable places to offer people. And so it includes things like, just not displacing them as a starting point, giving them access to drinking water, washroom facilities, supports, food, just ways to survive. I think that's kind of the starting point.
Yes, I can jump in. That is a great question. And it's actually, I've a lot of different thoughts, but I thought I would just share that last Thursday, so one of my projects is a project on thinking about sort of law reform that's aimed towards preventing youth eviction. Like, we know that youth are one of the groups that's most likely to lose their housing through eviction. And so we had this amazing community workshop in Saskatoon. And that question you just asked, Jessie, was one of the questions at one of the tables. So we asked, the youth who were in attendance, like, what would, what kind of world would you like to live in when it comes to housing and housing law and policy? And of course, they all talked about the need for safe and secure housing, like that's absolutely essential. But they also talked about the importance of, and I think this is one of the themes that's arisen today, is the importance of having those in positions of power like really take them seriously and take their lived experience and their perspective seriously. So I guess I would love to see an approach to law and decision making where we really are paying attention and listening to the voices of people who are experiencing the results of our laws and policies. And so that's going to be really important going forward.
Okay, great. Big question. Thanks. I always appreciate the magic wand question. If I really had a magic wand, don't want to get too far off track here and don't want to sound like a nerdy poli-sci grad, but it really is, the things we're talking about really are poverty and inequality. So it's really about, can you ask for a magic wand? It's really about taxation reform to make things more equal. We hear about like the rising tide, that's kind of the argument. If you like tax too much, that the rising tide raises all boats, or whatever. So like if you slow the economy, everyone suffers. But the fact of the matter is that that's only if you're just talking about your wallet. And the reality is that in real life, the quality of life is not just about your wallet. It's about the state of your community. It's about access to education. It's about access to good housing. It's about how your neighborhoods are doing. It's all those things. So if we look at all those things, that argument kind of falls apart. If you look at if you board Google government spending versus GDP, watch the little graph of what countries spend what, and just think about that and the quality of life in different places. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what we're talking about. Some of the issues we're talking about are human issues. So, when we talk about mental health and addiction, sorry, I got my filter here to shut up. Talk about things like mental health and addictions. Those are human issues. Those have been around here for as long as we've been organizing in this, as long as we've been humans. And they'll be here, come back in a long time, they'll be here too. But when you're talking about things like homelessness, that's a social construct. That's not a natural state. That's like we as a society decide if we're going to have homelessness or not. We know that because there's places with lots more homelessness than we have. And there's other places in the world that don't have homelessness really in an absolute sense. So that's the decision we make. And at the end of the day, it's a hard conversation. It's our political system makes it hard. But at the end of the day, that's what the conversation is about poverty and inequality, which is really about taxation. And we talk about a lot of other what do I say? We talk about a lot of other issues we have very little control over. And I think sometimes we shy away from that conversation because actually society has very immediate control over that, how resources are distributed. It's actually very immediate. There's people at the Ledge in Regina, there's people out in Ottawa that make those decisions, and they just they can make those. It doesn't take decades. It just can happen pretty fast. So anyways, I could go on, but thank you.
Well, maybe you have a magic wand in that treasure chest you got handed.
Yeah, that's right.
Unfortunately, there's some unanswered questions in the chat, but we're nearing the end of our time together, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time in the end time of 1:30. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank today's speakers, Sarah Buhler, Sharon Crowe, and Shawn Fraser. If you enjoyed this lecture, please keep an eye on the JSGS events calendar and the CBA Sask events calendar, where other upcoming events are being promoted. I noted somebody put a CPD in the chat as well. Karen will share those links to JSGS events calendar and CBA Sask events calendar in the links in the chat. And please join me in a round of applause for our speakers using the Zoom's reaction option Thank you all for joining us today and have a wonderful afternoon and a great sunny weekend.